There are stories in the life of Saint Teresa of Ávila that feel less like moments from a human biography and more like scenes from a world that runs parallel to ours, a world she never asked to see, but one God allowed her to witness so that the Church would never forget the reality of spiritual danger. This is one of those stories. It begins quietly, with Saint Teresa walking into a chapel during an ordinary day, expecting silence, prayer, and the soft flicker of candles. But instead of peace, she stepped into a vision so alarming that she would later recount it with trembling clarity. A priest at the altar, preparing to offer Mass while surrounded, completely, by demons. Not symbolic, not metaphorical, but real spiritual beings pressing against him like shadows made of malice. Before we enter the weight of that vision, tell me something simple. Where are you watching from? I love seeing people from every corner of the world gathering here, forming a kind of quiet community searching for truth. Drop your city and your country in the comments. And if you've been following these stories and want more deep, powerful Catholic history told with reverence and honesty, consider subscribing. It truly helps this channel reach more souls who need these reminders of the supernatural world we live in. When Saint Teresa described this moment, she did not use dramatic imagery to impress anyone. Her tone was calm, almost clinical, as if she were reporting a fact. But what she saw would disturb anyone who has ever believed, even faintly, in the spiritual warfare that surrounds us. As she entered the chapel, her soul was immediately seized by a sense of heaviness, the kind of suffocating oppression that precedes a storm. The candles flickered strangely, and she felt something was profoundly wrong. Only then did her spiritual sight open, a gift she never requested, but one God often permitted for the sake of the Church. The priest, an ordinary man whom she knew by name, appeared as though wrapped in a thick, sickening darkness. The creatures clinging to him were distorted forms, humanoid yet twisted. Like heat rising from a flame, but with shape and intention, they wrapped themselves around his shoulders, gripped his arms, and whispered, constantly, into his ears. Teresa froze. The priest seemed unaware. He continued preparing the altar, adjusting his vestments, murmuring the prayers, completely blind to the horror suffocating him. She realized instantly what this meant. The man was living in mortal sin, and the demons were not merely tempting him. They had legal claim over his soul. To offer Mass in such a state was an act of terrifying spiritual danger, not only for him, but for all who were present. Teresa later said she could feel the disgust and rage the demons carried, their hatred for the sacred space they were forced to inhabit, and their delight that the priest had given them access to it. She wanted to cry out, to warn him to fall to the floor in intercession, but something held her back, a deep inner voice reminding her that the vision was not shown for her to interfere directly, but to understand a truth she would later teach. The spiritual condition of a priest affects the entire Church. When a priest lives in grace, hell trembles. When he descends into mortal sin, hell follows him. The priest lifted the paten, unaware that claw-like shapes gripped his wrists. Teresa watched the shadows tighten around him each time he whispered the holy words, as though the demons were trying to drag him back, to suffocate any flicker of grace that might attempt to break through. She described the scene as almost unbearable, not because she feared the demons, but because she felt a grief so profound it bordered on physical pain. She saw what sin had done to the soul of a man chosen by God. She saw the terrible dignity of the priesthood distorted into something fragile, wounded, vulnerable to corruption. Yet what shocked her most was the moment of consecration. As the priest held up the host, a burst of blinding light erupted from the Eucharist, pure, overwhelming, divine. And for a brief moment the demons recoiled violently, shrinking back from the light that radiated from Christ himself. Even through the veil of the priest's sin, Jesus came, honoring his promise to be present for the sake of the faithful. Teresa wept in silence. She realized that Christ's humility was so great that he would descend onto an altar held by unworthy hands, not because the priest deserved it, but because the people needed him. But the moment passed quickly. As soon as the priest lowered the host, the darkness returned, and the demons closed in again. Teresa felt the spiritual temperature of the entire chapel shift from beauty to dread. She sensed that the man was spiritually dying, not because God abandoned him, but because he had abandoned the grace that had once been freely offered. For the rest of the Mass, Teresa prayed with a desperation she had never felt before. She asked God for mercy, for intervention, for anything that might shake the priest into repentance. Yet an even deeper understanding slowly unfolded within her soul. Free will is terrifyingly powerful. Not even God forces a soul to choose light over darkness. The demons clinging to the priest were there because he allowed them entry through choices repeated again and again until habit became slavery. By the time Mass ended, Teresa was trembling. She never revealed the priest's name publicly. She carried that knowledge as a burden, not as gossip. What mattered was the warning. The vision became one of the most sobering lessons of her spiritual life, a testimony that no sin is private, especially for those chosen to stand at the altar. And before we continue, let me speak directly to you. If stories like this awaken something in your heart, whether fear, reverence, or a renewed awareness of the invisible world, consider subscribing and joining this journey. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? It's beautiful to see these reflections travel across oceans and reach hearts everywhere. Thank you for being here. In the days following that haunting vision, Saint Teresa moved through the convent with a silence that was not her usual contemplative calm, but a weighted stillness, as though she carried a truth too heavy to share. The image of the priest wrapped in shadows did not fade with time. Instead, it grew sharper, like a photograph developing in reverse. She could still recall the exact position of the demons, their movements, the suffocating darkness that clung to the man like a second skin. It was as if her soul had memorized every detail, so she would not dare forget the danger hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. She spent long hours in prayer, not with dramatic emotion, but with a quiet urgency. An urgency born from witnessing a soul in peril while still performing sacred duties that could bless others, yet could no longer purify him. That contradiction pierced her. She understood now more clearly than ever why spiritual writers compare mortal sin to a kind of interior blindness. The priest she had seen was fulfilling his role outwardly, but inwardly something essential had dimmed. The demons did not merely surround him. They pressed upon him like weights, reminders of a chain he had chosen link by link. Teresa began to reflect deeply on how such a fall happens. She knew the man had not begun his vocation with corruption. No one becomes a priest because he desires ruin. Something had eroded over time, perhaps unnoticed at first. Maybe he stopped praying with depth, then stopped praying with sincerity, then stopped praying at all unless duty demanded it. Maybe he allowed resentment to take root, or pride, or discouragement. Whatever path he had followed, it led him to a state where the supernatural world reacted to him not with grace, but with recoil. Teresa understood that sin hardens slowly, like clay left too long in the sun. One day pliable, the next impossibly rigid. Her spiritual director, sensing her unease, invited her to speak. She described the vision carefully, choosing her words with humility, yet not minimizing what she had seen. The director listened in grave silence. He did not question her sanity or exaggerate the meaning. He simply recognized the weight of responsibility God had placed on her shoulders. Souls sometimes receive visions not to terrify them, but to awaken them, to sharpen their love for the Church and their sense of spiritual urgency. Teresa felt this awakening in her own heart. She loved priests deeply, and seeing one so wounded tore at her spirit. As she prayed for him, she began sensing, not visually but interiorly, the loneliness that accompanies mortal sin. Not the loneliness of being without friends or affection, but a spiritual isolation, a coldness that wraps around a soul until it forgets what warmth feels like. She sensed that beneath the priest's outward routine lay a quiet despair he could not name. This intuition moved her to compassion rather than judgment. Those demons she had seen were not celebrating his power. They were feeding on his exhaustion, his discouragement, his spiritual slumber. And Teresa knew the devil rarely wins through sudden dramatic moments. He wins slowly, through the erosion of small promises. The thought that haunted her most deeply was not the presence of the demons, but the moment Christ descended during the consecration. She had seen light break through the darkness with breathtaking force. She had watched the demons recoil violently, unable to bear the holiness of the Eucharistic mystery. Yet despite that divine eruption, the priest remained unchanged. Grace exploded before him, yet his heart registered none of it. Teresa pondered that moment for days. Christ had come for the people, for the faithful present, but the vessel through which he came could no longer hold him. The tragedy was not that the Mass was invalid, it was that the man celebrating it drew no life from it. This realization brought Teresa to tears more than once. She could almost hear Christ's sorrowful words echoing, "I pour myself out for you, and yet you do not open your heart." The Mass remained a fountain of grace, but the priest had turned his cup upside down. And yet even in that, Teresa saw a glimmer of hope. If the demons fled at the smallest eruption of divine glory, then even a spark of repentance could unravel everything that bound the man. Slowly, her prayer shifted. It became less about describing the problem to God and more about offering herself to be part of the solution. She began offering her headaches, her fatigue, her cold nights in the chapel, her moments of dryness, small hidden sacrifices she placed before God, like coins offered for the ransom of a soul. She did not need to know the effect. It was enough to know that grace always responds to love. As the days passed, Teresa sensed something intangible yet real, a subtle stirring in the priest's soul. She could not see it, but she felt it during prayer, the way a person feels a shift in the wind. It was as though her intercession was clearing a small opening, a doorway where grace could finally enter. She prayed harder, sacrificed more, held onto hope with fierce gentleness. And somewhere, far from the convent walls, in the solitude of his own conscience, the priest began to feel restless. Patterns he had fallen into no longer soothed him. Thoughts he had ignored started to trouble him. His comfort in sin began to crumble. Teresa's prayers, hidden from the world, were chiseling cracks into the hardness around his heart. One evening, as she prayed before the crucifix, Teresa felt a sudden wave of compassion wash over her, not just for the priest, but for all priests who had grown weary or numb. She understood now the immense burden they carried, living at the front lines of spiritual warfare with targets marked on their souls. If demons clung so fiercely to the one she had seen, it was not because he was unimportant. It was because he was vital. A fallen priest wounds not only himself, but the entire flock entrusted to him. This realization deepened her mission. She resolved to pray not just for the one she had seen, but for all priests living in quiet battles the world never notices. She knew now that their strength or their fall could alter the spiritual atmosphere of entire communities. Yet, through all of this reflection and prayer, she never once forgot the image that began it all, the demons shrinking before the Eucharistic light. That memory became her anchor. It reminded her that no darkness is absolute, no demon invincible, no sin irreversible. Grace only waits for the smallest opening. The quiet stirring that Teresa had sensed in prayer soon took on a weight she could not ignore. It was as if heaven allowed her to feel the priest's interior struggle, not through visions this time, but through a gentle emotional pressure inside her soul. She felt his confusion, his fear of admitting how far he had drifted, his dread of being exposed. Yet underneath all of that, she sensed something even more fragile, a faint longing for mercy. This longing was small, timid, almost imperceptible, but it was there, flickering like the last ember beneath ashes that had been accumulating for years. Teresa understood that God often works in such hidden ways, disrupting complacency with quiet discomfort until the heart can no longer ignore the truth. One afternoon, while engaged in prayer, she felt a sudden, profound heaviness, not oppressive like the darkness she had once witnessed around him, but sorrowful and human. It was the weight of a conscience beginning to awaken. She felt that the priest, wherever he was, had reached a point where silence no longer felt safe. The echo of his own life was returning to him, forcing him to look at himself with new eyes. Teresa responded with immediate prayer, not desperate or panicked, but steady and maternal. She had become, in a mysterious way, a spiritual companion, walking with him across a battlefield he did not yet fully understand. In those moments, she reflected on the strange paradox of grace. God never forces himself on a soul, yet he never abandons it either. Grace arrives like a visitor who knocks repeatedly until the heart cannot pretend not to hear. She prayed that the priest would finally stop resisting that knock. She knew that one sincere moment of humility could open more doors in an instant than years of stubbornness could ever keep closed. The tragedy of mortal sin is not that God abandons the soul, but that the soul becomes afraid to turn and face the one who still waits with open arms. As she prayed, Teresa remembered countless confessions she had witnessed throughout her life, moments when ordinary people found extraordinary courage to face their sins. She had seen tears of relief wash away years of fear. She had seen hardened hearts soften in seconds. These memories nourished her hope. If God could move so freely in the lives of the simple, why not in the life of a priest who had once vowed his entire existence to him? Teresa believed that the greater the fall, the greater the miracle that could follow. She did not see a doomed man. She saw a man standing at the threshold of redemption, trembling, hesitant, uncertain, but not beyond reach. Days later, as she knelt in the chapel before dawn, she sensed a sudden shift, a sudden clarity, like a window opening in a room that had long been sealed. Her prayer felt lighter, freer, as though the resistance she had been pushing against had thinned. She did not see anything visually, yet she perceived unmistakably that something had changed in the priest's soul. Perhaps he had whispered a prayer for help. Perhaps he had felt a pang of guilt at the altar. Perhaps he had remembered the man he once hoped to be. Whatever it was, that tiny movement of the heart had created a crack big enough for grace to enter. Later, Teresa learned through discreet channels what had taken place. The priest, after years of avoidance and denial, had finally entered a confessional not as a confessor, but as a penitent. He had approached quietly, almost trembling, overwhelmed by the very sacrament he had taken for granted. The confession lasted a long time, not because he justified himself, but because he finally let truth speak without interruption. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be seen by God without masks, without excuses, without pride. And when he rose from that confessional, the darkness Teresa had once witnessed no longer surrounded him. This knowledge brought Teresa not triumph, but tears of gratitude. She saw in his conversion the triumph of divine mercy over demonic influence, the victory of a single moment of humility over years of spiritual decline. She understood now more fully that visions, no matter how frightening, are never ends in themselves. They are invitations to deeper love, deeper intercession, deeper compassion. Where she had once seen demons encircling a soul, she now saw angels drawing that same soul back toward the light. As she continued to reflect on the entire experience, Teresa felt compelled to share its deeper meaning with the Church, not the details, which she guarded with reverence, but the message. She insisted that no soul, not even a priest ensnared by long habits of sin, is beyond the reach of grace. She reminded her followers that demons may cling fiercely to a soul, but they cannot lock the doors of the heart. Only the soul itself can do that. And when that heart cracks open, even slightly, hell loses its grip instantly. She also spoke often about the responsibility of the faithful to support their priests through prayer. Not judgment, not gossip, not suspicion, prayer. A priest carries more spiritual weight than most people can imagine, and when he falters, the enemy rejoices with special delight. Teresa wanted the world to know that holiness is not an automatic gift given at ordination. It is a daily battle that requires love, sacrifice, and the intercession of the community he serves. Her experience reshaped her entire understanding of spiritual warfare. She saw that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, slowly loosening a soul's defenses until darkness slips in unnoticed. And she saw that God does not always intervene with spectacle. Sometimes he uses the hidden prayer of a cloistered woman to save a soul miles away. The victory of grace is often silent, unseen, and yet more powerful than any demonic assault. As we close this journey with Teresa, I want to speak directly to you watching this video. If this story touched your heart, if it stirred something in your spirit, I'd love for you to share in the comments where you're watching from. It means more than you know. And if you feel called, please subscribe so you can walk with us through more stories that lift the veil between the visible and the invisible. Your presence here isn't just a number, It's a blessing to this entire community. And if this video brought something meaningful into your life, consider offering a super thanks or a small support to help this channel continue bringing these powerful reflections and prayers into homes around the world. Every gesture, every comment, every prayer helps us reach more hearts. May God bless you deeply and protect your home with His light.